Okay, thanks everyone for coming out for this session and making it through to 4 o'clock and still being awake. That's pretty impressive, presumably because of the great coffee and other caffeine outside. Today I'm going to be talking about training the team. It was interesting in Chris's keynote this morning that he talked about a couple of things that I think are relevant to this, which is he said there's going to be many more people building software. He also said there's a whole bunch more projects being built, more tools and libraries and resources for us to build software with. The only thing that made me think about is, wow, that's an awful lot of training, because we've got all these new people coming on board and we've got to learn all these new things more and more quickly. If any of you remember back in the day when you were developing in Java or .NET maybe a decade ago, and then like Ruby seemed like things were moving faster, and now you've got Node where the best build system changes about every 60 days. So the question is, how do we do a better job of adopting those technologies? And that's what I want to talk about. One question I want to answer first, though, is why should you be listening to me about it? So just to give a very brief background, my name's Peter Bell, and there's a number of reasons why I'm relevant. The first is I was a contract member of the GitHub training team for a number of years. And I ended up writing and creating a bunch of materials. I created the Introducing GitHub book for O'Reilly, along with Brent Beer, created the Pearson Git and GitHub Live lessons content, created Mastering GitHub for Code School, now part of Pluralsight. And I even teach MBA students at Columbia Business School. What are these weird developers and how can you work with them by understanding technologies like GitHub so you can kind of see them in their natural environment? It's kind of like a safari for business people. And then my current thing is I'm founded with a number of great people, a company called Wheelhouse, where we're working with GitHub and other similar companies to build their definitive trainings, assessments, and certifications. So spent a bunch of time thinking about how do you train people effectively. So congratulations, you've decided to adopt some new technology. I'll use some examples around adopting Git or GitHub, but it might be you've finally decided to get into containerization, you're moving to React.js for the front end, you've even decided to move to Atom from an IDE, whatever it might be. So the question is, what do you do now? You need to make the decisions as to what technology to adopt, but then there's a couple of things you need to think about. One is, you need to have clear objectives for your training program for yourself or your team or your organization. And then the other thing you need to think about is how do you build meaningful competence? So what I want to do over the next 35 minutes or so is break this down and go through each of these areas. So the first one is objectives, and this is something that a lot of people don't think through precisely. I mean, the objective is, I want my team to be good at using this stuff. Yeah, I get that. But what does that mean in terms of breaking it down? Well, it means you've got to think about roles, capabilities, and then kind of do a needs assessment or a gap analysis. If we were to look at roles, I'll take the example of GitHub. Now, you can get as precise as you want with this, but if I was to give like a really broken down list, you could think there are stakeholders, business people who only really care to be able to see what's being done and how's it going. I just want to be able to see the open pull requests, the closed issues, stuff like that. So that's a relatively small subset of the Git and GitHub ecosystem they need to learn. Then maybe you have a collaborator, somebody who might not create content, but might give feedback on pull requests or issues as the rest of the team requires it. Next step might be a contributor. This might be somebody who primarily contributes through a web-based interface or maybe through a graphical interface like GitHub Desktop. Then you kind of move into the developer world where somebody really needs to be building competence in using Git on the command line effectively. And then there's a few specialists. You might want to have an integration specialist to figure out how you integrate LDAP with your GitHub Enterprise instance. A workflow consultant to rebase or not rebase, that is the question. Even a Git guru, because you need somebody when you reset hard head ~4 and you meant 3. You need somebody who actually knows how the reflog works so you can go get that stuff back and fix it for the team. Or when somebody decides a really good idea would just be to reset the last 20 commits and force push to master. So you need somebody who can go in and fix that stuff. And it's worth thinking about, you don't necessarily need to have all of these on your team. Integration or implementation specialist might be a role that you don't need ongoing. Maybe a third-party organization can help you with that. Most of the, and even the workflow you can get some consulting on. You'd probably need at least 1 or 2 Git gurus in the organization, though, to fix stuff, because that's going to be an everyday problem. So we talked about some of the roles. For each one of those roles, you then need to start to think about capabilities. What skills should these people have? And it's important to realize that it's about them, not you. It's not what stuff do I want to teach them. It's what stuff do I want to make sure they can actually do once I'm done with the teaching. So typically in learning, they call this learning objectives. So you'd have things like, well, I want this particular person to be able to understand what's being worked on in a repo. I want them to be able to see a list of open pull requests and have a sense that that's the current stuff that we're working on. And just like user stories, learning objectives can be epics, and they can kind of be deconstructed. So you might start with an epic, which is my high-level learning objective for this role, for this group of people on my team. I want them to be able to collaborate effectively. And like epics, like if I was asking you to go build an auction system and I said, I want the ability to auction stuff online. That's great as a kind of command intent or vision, but it's not very useful when you're like, so what does screen 7 look like? So you might start to deconstruct that into specific learning objectives for what set of competencies to you mean that somebody can collaborate well within a team. Maybe they can create a descriptive commit message. And then the final part that you ideally want to do, and this isn't always practical, is you want to identify the gap. Now that you've got a set of people that are supposed to fulfill a certain set of roles, you want to be like, okay, how do we determine how close they are today? How do we give them a test? Whether this is like one-on-one informal, just pairing with them a bit, or whether it's creating a formal assessment that lets you see, oh, wow, this person kind of knows the basics, but we really need to spend a little more time on reset or rebase or whatever it might be. So it's important to take a little bit of time to think about your objectives before you say, hey, let's just go buy this book or this video series, or let's bring a trainer in. They'll solve all our problems. Sometimes we will, but it's important to think about, the objectives, roles, capabilities, and the gap. Okay, so now let's break down the other side of it. You've determined you've got this bunch of people with a set of skills that they need to be able to deliver on, and you figured out the gap. What do you do now? Well, you want to build competence, right? You want somehow your team to be competent so that you trust them, not to force push a bunch of stuff to master they shouldn't. And it's worth thinking about this in terms of 2 areas. There's the stuff you want to somehow load into their brains, and then there are the specific techniques you're going to use to load that stuff effectively, efficiently, and sustainably into their brains. Unfortunately, the Microsofts aren't quite there yet, so we're going to have to go old school and actually teach people stuff. The first thing I want to talk about is the information. And this is probably where most training undertakings fail. I've seen quite a few training organizations where they do a relatively good job of teaching really bad ideas to fairly large numbers of people in an organization. To misquote William Gibson, there are best practices out there. There are good information, good resources on what to do. But the more time I spend teaching Git, the more horrified I am about just about everything else I see in public talking about it. I'll give you an example. I've got to ask, so how many people recognize this diagram? Yep. And how many people are using it as the basis of your flow? Yeah, and that's pretty common. I would say about half the organizations I go into. I'm not going to get into it now, but I'm just going to lob the hand grenade and say this is considered harmful. This is the Git flow model. It was actually a great idea. I remember loving Git flow when it first came out. I got my little command line tools, and I just run these little commands, and all this stuff magically happens. As a consultant, when I made a living going into organizations and fixing their Git repos, this was probably the thing that made me more money than anything else. Because theoretically, it's great, but what happens is somebody forgets to go to the develop branch, and so they create a feature branch off of master, and then someone else is on a release branch, and they don't realize it, and they create a feature branch there, but that's okay, because then they merge that into master or into develop, and you end up with these commits that will just never die. I'm sure none of you have come across this in your organizations. So there's stuff like this that is still being taught as best practices. And you know this must be a good idea because there's a whole bunch of articles on Stack Overflow telling you it is. I very specifically picked that logo rather than another one from Stack Overflow because it kind of, there's some awesome ideas there, and there's the other stuff. And the question is, how do you differentiate one from the other? So you should be like, well, that's okay if Stack Overflow doesn't necessarily have all the answers. We know who does. There are all these great publishing companies we can go to, and I've worked with many of them. The challenge is there's a real difference between, and I've noticed this teaching one topic for 5 years, there's a huge difference in the cycle time in publishing and training. I was at a speaker's dinner last night speaking with a bunch of the services team from GitHub, the people that I often work with when I go out on training engagements. And we were still arguing about, what's the right way to teach this and in what order should we teach these things. And I would say we probably refine the way that we teach people stuff every week, every class, certainly every 2 or 3 weeks. All my published materials and pretty much all the other ones out there, the publishers every 1 or 2 years is like, oh, you should probably update that thing. So the challenge is stuff published in traditional media is not necessarily the latest best practices. So you really need to think about how can we get not just information about the tools, but also what are the latest best practices that people are now using to do this more effectively. I want to call out one specific example. A couple years ago, I was teaching a class on Redis for a large software company in Silicon Valley. And usually what I'll do if I'm teaching a new technology, I download it, read a few blog posts, read a couple of books, and I'm like, I'll figure the rest out from there. I was very pleasantly surprised when I read the Redis. Anyone read this, just out of interest, Redis cookbook? If for any reason you ever end up adopting Redis, that's the book to get. Because pretty much all the other books out there on pretty much any NoSQL data store, the vast majority of them are like, it kind of feels like the man page only printed, right? It's like, here's the things you should do, and here are the options, and here are the settings. This one was like, oh, don't use that feature, because in production at scale, these things go wrong. The organizations that use this regularly do this instead. And it was giving you really detailed insight from somebody who'd clearly spent years actually doing this in production. So that's the kind of information you're looking for. The only challenge, it sounds like I'm kind of talking about, so what you really need to do is find best practices. The only problem with best practices is there aren't any, right? There aren't just, well, this is the way that an engineering team should use a workflow. One of the things that's been fascinating to me is I used to think I knew the right workflow to use Git and GitHub. And then I taught at more and more and more different enterprises with totally different use cases, and it turns out that almost everything you can come across in Stack Overflow is a good idea for someone. It's probably just not a good idea for you. So in fact, you don't want like this one best practice, like this is the way you shall do it. You want to take more of a kind of decision tree approach. Let me give an example. Release branches. Who here uses release branches? Yeah, it's a pretty common pattern. A good way of introducing release branches is that you don't need them unless. And what's interesting is you can start by saying, well, look, let's say you've got master and you've got a number of commits. Let's say we're running continuous delivery. Anything hits, and I've simplified this because I really didn't have the time in the diagramming tool to bring out all the feature branches that would be merging in. So imagine each one of those commits is really just merging in a feature branch with a number of commits. Well, if you're doing continuous delivery, you really don't need release branches. You just work on something. As soon as you merge it into master, 5-10 minutes later, it's in production. So there's really nothing else to do. But then what happens if you're in a situation where not every single one of those goes to production? Well, then often it's a good idea to create release tags. So then at least you're tagging in the code base to make it clear which of these were actually production releases and which ones weren't. So annotated tags are a good fit for this. And you can even use those to get kind of sign-off from different departments and to capture that within the code base. So what happens if you have a bug? Turns out that sometimes you get into production and something's a bug. Well, you may create a release branch, either off of the latest merge commit or even an earlier one. You go fix your changes because you don't want to be committing directly to master, and then you fix those changes, And once you're done and you've tested them, you merge that into master. So you have a release branch for about 20 minutes or 2 hours, and then you throw it away. And in fact, the only time you actually need long-lived release branches, it's not an uncommon use case, is if you have different code running on different servers at the same time, different versions of the code, where there is at least one bug since the code diverged. And that's basically the use case for release branches. But rather than having these big arguments about, they're a good idea or they're a bad idea, it's like, no, you don't need them unless. And you can kind of build out these decision trees that will take people step by step to identify for a given set of use cases or requirements what they should be doing. Another way of thinking about the information you want to be communicating to your team is in terms of trade-offs. Turns out, so I got to ask this one, so do you rebase feature branches or not? Just show of hands, how many people will rebase a feature branch? Yep. And how many people don't rebase a feature branch? Yeah, it depends upon the audience. Here it's a little heavy on rebasing, but I see about 50-50 across the range of entities I work with. Turns out there's a very simple, distinct, and clear trade-off. The first level heuristic is, what do you look for your history most? Git or GitHub? If you primarily want a clean Git log history, you should rebase your feature branches because then it's going to make it look like you built one feature at a time, which is awesome. If, however, you want to see what was done in the last month and you just look at the closed pull requests, you probably shouldn't rebase your feature branches. Why? Because all of your line level commits are going to disappear from your pull requests because all the SHA-1 hashes of the commits have changed. So there's actually this very simple trade-off or heuristic, which is, do you primarily look at history as closed pull requests or as Git log? And whichever one of those you want to optimize for in your workflow drives whether or not you should rebase your feature branches. And again, it's not the Stack Overflow thing where this is right, this is wrong. You have to look across multiple use cases to try to determine how you pick between them and what the trade-offs are. So we've talked a little bit here about the information. The most important thing you want to do garbage in, garbage out is make sure you have great information to share with your team before you work really hard at getting them to memorize and practice it. Once you've done that, though, then we've got to talk about learning. How do we actually get these best practices and best ideas into ourselves and our teams? First point I want to make, is that teaching is not learning. The fact that I stand up here and tell you a bunch of stuff, and this is kind of gently ironic that I'm standing up here telling you a bunch of stuff, including telling you this isn't a very good way to convey information. Sorry, they didn't allow me to do a hands-on workshop. It's kind of hard to organize for this many people with Wi-Fi. But this is actually a very inefficient way to communicate information. I should have just written a blog post and saved myself the flight. However, it's a relatively good way to get people motivated to say, I'm not sure that I remember everything he said, but it sounds like there's some stuff I should think about here. So now I'm going to go read a blog post or go look at some companies and some solutions to do this better in the future. But just standing up and talking to your team, whether you hire someone to do it or do it yourself, is not enough to change their capabilities on its own. So what do you need? We need a number of things, but the key things you've got to focus on when you're thinking about getting people to adopt new technologies successfully and become competent in them is motivation, active participation, and practice. If they don't care, there's no point. You're not going to be able to force the learning into their skulls. So the first thing you've got to do is actually make a connection and agree. The number of times I'll go into a company and there's that one, usually slightly older guy in the corner is like, I don't see what's wrong with CVS. It was good enough for me 15 years ago. Don't know why we're wasting our time. And unless you can turn that around and actually come up with some problems that they've had in the past that they care about, there's some emotional attachment to, there's no point doing the rest of it because they're not going to hear you. Active participation, again, me standing up and talking at you, unfortunately, is not the best way to convey the information. You actually doing quizzes, puzzles, working on things, building real projects is the way you're going to internalize competence. And then finally, practice. And this is one of the hardest things I find when I'm building courses for people. Most people are like, oh, yeah, you showed me this 3-stage thinking, adding, committing, we're done. But if they only do it once, you come back a week later, unless they go straight into a Git-based project, they will have completely forgotten the skill. So you need to be thinking about how you can get people to do these things a few times to actually build muscle memory, competence, and confidence. There's a few other things I wanted to put in. One thing I want to talk about was types of learning. This is something we don't always break down from an engineering perspective, but there's a number of different kinds of learning that people need to undertake to become competent with new software. It varies for different things, but for example, conceptual, factual, skills acquisition, and even cultural acclimatization. Let's look at these one at a time. So, conceptual learning. What is a pull request? What is a commit? Often this is a matter of like coming up with good analogies so that people can take stuff they already understand. Oh, this is Uber for cats. I get it. Pull requests. It's a conversation around a branch. Oh, I know what a branch is. I know what a conversation is. Now that starts to make more sense. And it's important often to give people multiple examples or analogies so that one of them hits for everyone, and to give them real practice, like, so when would you create a pull request? When wouldn't you create a pull request? How would you decide between a pull request and an issue? And in fact, when you're working with conceptual knowledge, quizzes can be a really good way to get active participation. And it turns out that you're not only testing someone's competence, turns out there's a whole set of really interesting neuroscience behind this, but the process of retrieving information actually increases the myelination, the connections within the brain. So the bottom line is quizzes are a really good way to help people to learn stuff. Even to the extent, one study that was really fascinating was called pre-testing. Turns out that if you ask somebody a bunch of questions about something they know nothing about, and then teach them, they will recall a substantially higher proportion of that information. So actually there's value in just going through a quiz and like, I have no idea. You will then actually, your brain will then do a better job of retaining the information after the fact. Talking of facts and factual information, sometimes you just need to remember, so what is the command to list all branches? How do I throw away a merge commit? What command do I use for that? And in addition to just giving this information, sometimes it makes sense to do things like Anki, for example, is a tool that you can use to kind of build flashcards. So why not have flashcards so you can actually go through and make it easier to memorize this? Cheat sheets, sticky notes, things like that can help you to persist factual information more successfully for your team. Then we've got skills acquisition. Good example, maybe Vim key combinations, right? Anybody who's ever moved from Vim to Emacs or the other way has probably had an interesting experience that required more than just conceptual understanding and retaining a few facts. You have the muscle memory, and it's wrong. It's like when you go from IntelliJ to Visual Studio or whatever it might be. So it's important to think here then about how can you give hands-on exercises and actually build that familiarity with the particular skill that you're trying to help people acquire. There's even things like cultural acclimatization. One of the biggest challenges I find within more traditional enterprises is I used to do a bunch of agile coaching. I'm like, okay, we're now going to sit in a room and admit to all the stuff we did wrong. And usually there's kind of dazed silence, and somebody like takes me out later and explains that that's the way that the last engineering team got fired, by admitting the stuff they'd done wrong, and they don't want to do that. So often, you also have to think from a cultural perspective about how you, the number of times where I explain GitHub and they're like, well, wait a minute, how do I make sure this developer can't edit that file or can't see that file? Or how do I make sure that nobody force pushes over master? Okay, we got protected branches now, but it's a fundamentally different set of cultural assumptions underlying GitHub than would be underlying some traditional centralized VCSs. So it's important to actually break down as you look at the capabilities required and think about the different kinds of learning that need to be accomplished, and how are you going to pick the right approaches for each one of those to make your team succeed. A few other concepts I want to throw in fairly quickly. I want to talk about something called project-based learning. This is one that you have to be a little careful with because it doesn't mean exactly what it sounds like. I would argue project-based training is something that we're familiar with. I'm going to give you a project or a lab, and you go through and do that. In educational circles, they call that problem-based learning, because it's kind of like giving you the 20 differential equation math problems, and you have to work through them to become competent. Project-based learning is actually something a little different, and it's both good and bad. With project-based learning, you take students and you give them an environment where you say, let's figure this stuff out. Let's do some exploratory work. So for example, I might take a bunch of MBA students, and if I really wanted them to get why bother with a version control system, I might start with a thought experiment. Let's use Google Docs to keep track of a document. And the good news is you can track changes there, right? I don't need no stinking VCS. I got it right in Google Docs. And then I'm like, okay, so this is great. So now what I want you to do, because we're going to put a bunch of documents in this directory, I want you to make one change atomically that affects 3 different documents. How are you going to do that? And usually they'll come up with ideas like, well, we're going to give it a special ID number, and we're going to put that in the comment reference on each of the 3 Google Docs. Like, congratulations, you've just discovered version control systems, right? You've just discovered a single commit that takes a series of changes to different files. And then you start doing things like, what about branches or sandboxes? How could we solve a problem where I could be making one set of changes to a Word document and you could be making another set, and we could jump between them? And people end up like making different copies of the files and doing these things so they can kind of build up and explore an understanding for the problems that a version control system really solves. The good news is this is an incredibly powerful way to share new conceptual information. Bad news is it's really freaking slow. I mean, you can spend like an hour learning why a version control system is a good idea, or you can put 3 bullets on a slide. So you have to, this is a great approach, but you have to use it carefully, focusing only on the cases where it really matters, and generally where people have a hard time otherwise retaining the information. Another thing I want to talk about that we do horribly in enterprise training, differentiated learning. My job, usually when I kind of fly into a company and I'm teaching a bunch of people, my job is to bore half the room and overwhelm the other half, right? I mean, that's how it works. Because there's some people who are like, what's the command line? And others are like, so I wanted to ask you this reflog question before we get started. And it turns out that when you have that breadth, that disparity of initial capabilities, it's really hard to do a good job of an instructor-led training. So in this case, some of the things you want to be thinking about is assessments, so that people can test out, hey, you don't need to do day 1 because you figured out this quiz or you built this project successfully, and we see that you understand the basics of the GitHub workflow. Thinking about giving people multiple problems, so maybe you can focus on a particular type of content, but then people can go deeper if they're blown through the first problem in 5 minutes. So differentiated learning, I think, is one of the big challenges that we face in terms of how do we do a good job of not wasting our team's time, because you don't want people to be overwhelmed or they won't learn the new technologies, and you don't want other people to be bored or you're just burning money and time. This is probably the thing we do worst in terms of training our team. How many people here have ever brought a trainer in to teach something in your organization? Internally, externally, you've had like a training day, okay. And how many of you did another one 2 days later, another one week later, and another one 2 weeks after that to make sure the information stuck? It's not economic, it's not practical. So one thing we really need to be thinking about when we're training our teams, whether internally or with partners, is how do we make sure that the stuff we tell them is actually going to be retained? And again, this idea of quizzing people to get them to save the information more effectively, turns out that the best thing you can do is spaced repetition, where a day later you go through some of the content, then about a week later, then about 2 weeks later, to make sure that it's retained effectively. Because otherwise, you just wasted a day and a bunch of, developer time on nothing. I've got this far in the talk without actually talking about people, other than the people we're going to cram this knowledge into. So I want to talk about people because there's a number of elements to this. The 2 big ones are community and instructors. One of the things you can do to improve the effectiveness of training or learning is to build some kind of community. Sometimes it's for collaboration. Hey, I want the 2 of you to buddy up, or I want 4 of you to work on a team, and nobody kind of passes unless you all do. So it's a way of ensuring that a group of people can help each other to be more successful with new content. You can also do competition. It's why the whole gamification works. Prove that you know more Git than anybody else at your company. Who's going to be the Git guru this week? But what this really is it's just simply a form of motivation, because it's kind of obligation. You give me a book, I might get around to reading it. You tell me that you're going to compare my skills against somebody else or get me to work in a team by the end of the week, I kind of feel like I have a responsibility to the rest of the team to get that done. Then we have the role of the instructor, the TA, the teacher, whatever you want to call them. And probably the best way to think about this, I think, going forward, is they're kind of context-sensitive help. Yes, so basically, I'm arguing that me and we are clippy. Hopefully, we're just a little better at giving you the right answers. Because that's really what differentiates an instructor. They're telling you the stuff you need to know in the way that immediately answers the question you have today. So information, telling them the right stuff, plus learning, ensuring that they adopt it successfully is the way that you help your team to build competence. For now, of course, because it turns out that the best practices keep on changing, and then you move from one containerization strategy to another, and you move from Chef to Ansible for your platform, for your infrastructure as a service. So it's kind of this ongoing process, both with the tools you're familiar with and with the ones that you're not. So my goal today was really just to say that the next time you think about adopting a technology, whether it's Git and GitHub, or whether it's something else, you need to be thinking about how are we going to ensure the capabilities of the team? What are our objectives? What kind of roles are people going to need to perform? What capabilities, what are the learning objectives going to be? What are they going to be able to do once they're trained? And which of those things can't they do now, so we can waste the minimum of their time moving them from their current skill set to the capabilities they need? And then making sure to take the time to think about the right information. How can you get great best practices, trade-offs, and decision trees to help your team to figure out exactly what practices they should be using for your particular workflows? And then thinking about some strategies for learning to make sure that the information you share with them is synthesized, retained, and applied. Great. Any questions? Cool. Well, would you believe you get 5 minutes more for a break, great conversations, and coffee? Thank you very much for coming out. If you want to speak, feel free to come up.